The sun was sinking behind the distant hills, casting a golden haze over the dry plains when Eli Carson spotted the figure near his northern fence. At first he thought it was a coyote slumped in the dirt, but as he drew closer, horseback and rifle in hand, the shape didn't move. It was a man bare-chested, skin darkened by sun and dust, one leg twisted oddly beneath him. Eli dismounted slowly, eyes scanning the horizon. No horse, no pack, no weapons. Just the man, breathing shallowly, his lips cracked, eyes closed. Something was wrong, deeply wrong, but Eli didn't move for a long while. He studied the man's face, then noticed something else. The eyes didn't blink. They were open, unfocused. Blind. Eli crouched beside him, the leather of his gloves creaking as he brushed dust from the man's face. The skin was burned raw in places, the brow smeared with dried blood. The man didn't flinch. He just whispered a single word in a tongue Eli didn't understand, so softly the wind almost swallowed it. Eli looked back toward his ranch house, now just a silhouette against the burning sky. He wasn't a man who took in strays or strangers, but something about this felt different. The man was no more a threat than a dying bird, yet his presence vibrated with something heavy. Eli stood, hesitated, then finally muttered, "Damn it," and bent to lift him. He brought the man inside as night fell, laying him gently on a blanket. By the fire, the old wooden floor creaked beneath his boots as he fetched a basin of water and a clean cloth. The stranger remained still, his breath shallow but steady. Eli worked in silence, cleaning the man's wounds, dabbing his face with wet cloths. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him through the walls. Maybe it was the absurdity of it all. Maybe it was guilt. He'd lived alone for almost a decade, and now he had a blind native man bleeding on his rug. He didn't even know why he cared, but he did. The night outside was silent, broken only by coyotes calling in the far hills. Inside, the fire cracked softly. The man stirred once, his fingers twitching as if reaching for something unseen. Eli gave him a sip of water, holding the tin cup carefully to his lips. The man drank without opening his eyes, then whispered another word, this time in English. 3 days, he said, almost inaudible. Eli leaned closer, unsure if he'd heard right. 3 days, the man repeated, then nothing, just the slow, even rise and fall of his chest. Eli sat back, his brow furrowed. What happens in 3 days? He muttered to himself. The man didn't answer. By morning, the man still hadn't moved much. Eli made coffee and stared at him over the rim of his mug. The light of day didn't ease the unease in his gut. He opened the window slightly and let in the cool prairie breeze. The blind man's breathing had evened out. He looked less ghostly in the sun, though no less mysterious. Eli thought of riding into town, maybe sending word to the tribal elders, but something told him not to. Maybe it was the way the man had said 3 days, like it meant something sacred, like a countdown. Eli didn't believe in superstition, but he believed in his instincts, and they were telling him to wait. He spent the day working near the house, chopping wood, keeping the cattle close. He didn't stray far. Every hour he checked on the man. Midday, the stranger sat up slowly, unassisted. His eyes were still vacant, but his body seemed stronger. Eli offered him bread and boiled beans. The man nodded once in thanks, never speaking. Not even when Eli tried to make conversation, just silence, stillness. And yet Eli didn't feel alone. There was a quiet presence in the house now, like the walls were listening, watching. The man didn't ask for anything, didn't demand. He just existed, and somehow that was louder than words. That evening, as the sun bled into the sky again, Eli found himself sharpening his tools with more urgency than usual. He didn't know why. No threats had come, no strangers had appeared, but something was shifting. He could feel it in the animals, restless in the barn. He caught himself glancing at the horizon, expecting ... What? Riders, storms? He didn't. No. All he knew was that he had taken in a man who said nothing, saw nothing, and yet seemed to know everything. Eli didn't regret his decision, not yet, but he wondered what kind of debt he had unknowingly stepped into. Later that night, unable to sleep, Eli stepped outside. The stars above were sharp and clear, the moon hanging low like a heavy eye. He looked out toward the dark plains stretching endlessly around his home. Somewhere out there, something was coming. He could feel it. He thought of the man inside, how he arrived with no footsteps, no sound, no name. A man who asked for nothing. But 3 days, Eli didn't know what to expect on the fourth. But whatever it was, he sensed it wouldn't be quiet, and it wouldn't be small. The fire had burned low by the time Eli sat down beside the stranger once more. He didn't speak. He just stared into the flickering embers, coffee in hand, boots still caked with dry dirt. The man lay still, arms at his sides, breathing steady but shallow. Eli didn't know what he was expecting. A thank you, maybe, or some kind of explanation, but none came. Only silence. And somehow, that felt right. He wasn't owed anything. Whatever this man had been through, it wasn't something that needed words. Eli knew wounds like that ran deeper than blood, so he stayed quiet, just keeping the fire alive. It was nearly midnight when the man finally shifted. Slowly, he turned his head toward Eli, and though his eyes were clouded, it felt as if he was seeing him clearly. 3 days, he said, again, voice low but calm. That's all I ask. Eli nodded once, not bothering to question it. He didn't need details. There was something in the man's tone, solid, deliberate, that made him trust it. He'd met liars before. This wasn't one. The man wasn't hiding. He was waiting. And that, more than anything, unsettled Eli. He had no idea what would come on day 4, but he found himself nodding again anyway. They didn't speak much after that. The man drifted in and out of sleep, and Eli tended to the fire, adding wood, adjusting the blankets. At one point, the man winced and reached for his side. Eli helped him sit up and offered water, which he drank slowly. Then he whispered something in a language Eli didn't recognize. It wasn't meant for understanding, for remembering. Eli didn't ask what it meant. He only placed a hand on the man's shoulder and said, "You're safe here." The man didn't smile, but a quiet calm settled over him. As if those words were enough, by dawn, Eli was back outside, feeding the horses and hauling water to the troughs. He kept glancing back at the house as if it might vanish or be surrounded by riders at any moment. The land was quiet maybe, but the air had changed. There was a tension underneath it, like a string pulled too tight. Eli had lived on this land long enough to sense when something was coming. He just didn't know from where or what shape it would take. Still, he kept his hands busy. That was the only way to stop his thoughts from spinning in circles. Inside, the man hadn't moved from the blanket. But when Eli returned around noon, he found him sitting upright, listening. It was strange to watch someone listen with that kind of intensity, like the house itself was telling him things. "You live alone?" the man asked, voice steady despite the strain. Eli hesitated, then nodded. "Since '89, he said simply. The man nodded once, as if he'd already known. "Good," he replied. "Less noise, less confusion. That was all. No condolences, no curiosity, just quiet acceptance, like the solitude was part of some larger plan." As the sun moved through the windows, Eli offered soup and a slice of bread. The man accepted with grace, though his hands trembled slightly. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, like it had weight. Eli sat across from him, arms crossed, still saying nothing. He didn't ask why the man had come here. Didn't ask what had happened to his eyes. Didn't even ask his name. He figured if the man wanted to speak, he would, and if he didn't, that was fine too. Some men needed time, others needed silence. Eli understood both. That evening, as the wind picked up and dust began to crawl across the horizon, Eli stood on the porch and lit a lantern. He scanned the plains, but saw nothing, just open land stretching forever. But something was coming. He could feel it like a low hum beneath the ground. He turned and looked back at the house, the man's silhouette barely visible through the curtain. 3 days. It didn't sound like a threat, but it didn't sound like a promise either. It sounded like a reckoning, and Eli wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. When he went back inside, the man was already lying down, blanket pulled up to his chest. His breathing was steady, hands folded neatly. Eli sat by the hearth again, boots off now, hat resting on his knee. He didn't speak, just stared at the flames, letting the silence settle like dust. No questions asked, no answers. Needed only 3 days. By the second morning, the air around the ranch felt heavier, more alert. Eli didn't need to be told. He knew the wind had carried whispers. The neighbor 2 miles south, Mr. Burrows, had likely seen something, maybe the outline of a second shadow in the window, maybe a boot print near the well that didn't match. Eli's size. Folks around these parts didn't need much to start talking. And once talk began, it spread like prairie fire. A blind native man in a white rancher's home. That was all they needed to feel justified in their suspicion. It didn't take long before Eli saw a cloud of dust rising on the southern trail. A horseman, not fast but not casual either. Eli wiped his hands on a rag and stepped off the porch as the rider approached. It was Sheriff Holt, grizzled barrel-chested, at the kind of man who believed law and loyalty were the same thing as long as they ran in his direction. "Morning, Carson," he said, dismounting with a grunt. "Heard someone was wandering close to your land. You seen anything strange the past few nights?" Eli kept his eyes steady. "Just stars and coyotes." Holt didn't press, not right away. But he looked toward the house, toward the shaded windows. "Someone said they saw you bringing a man across the fence line." He continued, "Tall, dark skin, not local." Eli shrugged. "I bring in strays now and then, mostly calves, sometimes wounded coyotes. You know how quiet it gets out here." The sheriff gave a dry chuckle, but his eyes didn't follow the joke. "Well," he said, mounting again, "if you see anything that ain't livestock, let me know. You know the times we're living in." Eli nodded once and watched him ride away. The sheriff's words echoed long after he was gone. "You know, the times we're living in." Eli did know, and he knew them too well. His mind drifted to the memory of his father, standing at the edge of a burning barn, gun drawn, shouting at 3 armed men to back away. It was 1962. The man they were hunting was a young Apache who'd been shot twice and had crawled into their hayloft. Eli was just a boy, but he remembered the smoke, the shouting, and the silence that followed the gunfire. His father had survived, but the scars never healed right. That night, Eli sat by the fire while the blind man slept. The flames popped and cracked like the echoes of old rifles in his memory. He thought of how history never really ended out here, it just circled back in quieter shapes. This land remembered everything. Every broken treaty, every buried name, every betrayal soaked into the dirt. People like Holt pretended those ghosts had moved on, but Eli knew better. They were still here, and now, one of them was sleeping under his roof. He didn't regret it, not yet, but the weight of consequence pressed heavier with each hour. If the sheriff came back with questions instead of small talk, things could turn quickly. People had been killed for less in these parts. That made the silence in the house all the more deafening. Eli wondered if the man understood what kind of risk he'd brought with him. Or maybe he did. Maybe he'd chosen this house because of that risk, because of who Eli was or used to be. In the early hours, the man stirred and spoke, his voice almost part of the wind. They're already watching. Eli didn't respond. He didn't ask who they were. He just nodded and leaned back in his chair, letting the words settle. He realized something then: this wasn't just about protection. This was about remembering. The land remembered. The people remembered. And now Eli would have to remember, too, whether he was ready or not. The fire burned low again, casting long shadows on the walls. When the blind man spoke with clarity for the first time, his voice cut through the quiet like the sound of a branch snapping in still woods, unexpected, but not jarring. "Eyes aren't everything," he said, not facing Eli, but knowing exactly where he sat. "People trust what they see. That's why they miss everything else." Eli didn't reply. He was used to silence by now, but something in those words pressed deep, like they'd been meant for him alone. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, listening. "They think you're alone. Out here," the man continued, hands folded across his lap. "But you're not." His voice wasn't threatening, but it had weight. "This land has memory and ears." Eli glanced toward the window. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the walls, and the cattle were unusually quiet. The house, old and creaky, seemed to lean in to listen. "Who's watching?" Eli asked finally. The man turned his head slightly. "Not the ones you fear. Others." That was all he gave, and Eli didn't push for more. Dinner was simple: boiled potatoes, a little dried meat. The blind man ate slowly, carefully, as if each bite was ceremonial. "You've carried something for a long time," he said between mouthfuls. Eli stopped chewing. "Regret." The word landed heavy. "You think this land forgot, but it hasn't." Eli set down his fork, heart thudding slower than before. He didn't remember telling the man anything personal. He hadn't, but somehow, this stranger had read him like scripture carved into wood. Night deepened and the fire cracked again. Eli poured a second mug of coffee, but didn't offer one to the man this time. Still, the man spoke. "Those who come in silence," he said softly, "never forget an act of courage." The sentence hung in the air, stirring a chill in Eli's spine. It didn't feel like flattery. It felt like warning, or maybe prophecy. Eli didn't want to ask what would happen after the third day. Part of him already knew. Something old was moving again, something tied to what this land had once seen and buried. The blind man turned his head slightly toward the fire, as if he could see the flicker. "They'll come when the earth stills," he said, "when even the wind kneels." Eli looked at the coals and felt, not fear but anticipation, like the pause before a storm hits. When the animals know before the sky does. He didn't understand what was coming, but he knew it was real. Every instinct in him, every cell hardened by years of isolation, now stirred with alertness. He wasn't just sheltering a man anymore. He was standing on a threshold. Before bed, Eli brought in more wood. The barn door creaked louder than usual. The night felt different, dense, aware. As he passed the porch, he stopped. There were no stars above. The sky had gone flat, black, heavy, not cloudy, just still. He stood there for a long time, staring upward, boots planted firmly in the dirt. He had seen storms, he had buried men, but nothing felt quite like this. And inside, that man, blind, bruised, unreadable, was at the center of it all. When Eli returned indoors, the blind man was sitting up again, blanket around his shoulders. He didn't speak this time. He only nodded once, as if confirming what Eli had just felt outside. The firelight danced on the man's face, highlighting the soft, glassy sheen in his sightless eyes. For a second, Eli felt as if the man wasn't blind at all, but was simply seeing something else. Something far away, or far ahead. Eli sat nearby but didn't say goodnight. Words felt too small now. He didn't sleep that night. Not really. Just sat near the hearth, shotgun resting across his lap, staring into the dark, waiting for a sound that never came. The wind didn't rise. No coyotes cried. The world, it seemed, had taken a breath and was holding it by morning. The air was thick and swollen, like the sky had something to say but wasn't ready to speak. Eli stepped out onto the porch, eyes narrowing at the horizon. A line of dark clouds hung low, far off but moving steady. Not a dust storm, this was heavier. A real storm, one that would snap trees and flood dry ground. He pulled his coat tighter, boots crunching against the brittle soil. Inside the house, The blind man stirred. "It's coming," he said before Eli could say it himself, as if he didn't need to see it, as if he could feel the weight in the wind. Eli spent the morning tying down loose boards, reinforcing the barn doors, checking the roof for weak spots. He was halfway through stacking feed sacks against the cellar hatch when the man appeared. In the doorway, blanket over his shoulders, barefoot. "The left shutter's loose," he said, pointing toward the window that faced west. Eli stared. He hadn't even checked it yet. "How do you?" he started, but stopped himself. The man was right, and Eli didn't question him again. They worked quietly through the day. The man moved slow, but precise. He could hear the hinges creak, the wind angle through cracks. "That beam won't hold if the wind turns south," he warned as Eli braced. The porch post, Eli adjusted it without argument. With each task, their rhythm grew more in sync. Eli handed him tools without needing to speak. The man passed them back the same way. They didn't need words. There was a language in shared work, in sweat and silence and effort. It built trust more than any story could dot by late afternoon. The sky had turned to iron. No birds flew. The cattle pressed close to the fence, heads low, uneasy. The wind picked up in gusts, not steady, nervous, unpredictable. Eli closed the barn and bolted the doors from the inside. "You've done this before," he said as they stood on the porch, watching the sky collapse into shadow. "Storms come in many forms," the man replied. "Some wear clouds, others wear men's faces." Eli looked at him then, trying to read what he meant, but the man was still calm, like he'd seen worse. They stepped inside just as the first drops hit the roof sharp, heavy, urgent. Within minutes, it turned into a downpour, the kind that drowns footsteps and voices. The wind howled through the gaps, but the house held steady. The blind man sat by the fire, head tilted slightly as if listening to the storm's conversation. "It's not here for us," he said softly. Eli didn't answer. He was watching the windows, shotgun leaned by the door. Yet, despite the weather's fury, a strange peace had settled between them. Like the house had earned its silence. Hours passed, rain drummed the roof, thunder rolled low across the plains. Eli brought in more wood and poured coffee. The blind man didn't sleep but didn't speak either. Just sat cross-legged near the hearth, breathing slow. "You trust me now?" he asked suddenly without turning. Eli blinked. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I do not trust you." The man nodded once, satisfied. "That's enough." And it was the storm outside could have ripped the roof clean off. But in that room, something had already anchored itself. Sometime after midnight, the wind eased. The rain softened to a whisper. The storm had passed, leaving the world slick and new. Eli opened the door and stepped outside. The air smelled like ash and wet earth. He could see stars again, faint but clear behind him. The man stood in the doorway. "You held your ground," he said. "The house did too." Eli turned to face him. "Storms don't scare me," he said. The man smiled faintly. "Good. Then you're almost ready." Eli didn't ask, ready for what? He just nodded, then looked out at the land, waiting for morning. Back inside, the fire had gone low, but neither man stirred it. They didn't need warmth now. Just rest. Just the knowledge that something had shifted between them. Not just survival, not just help. Something deeper. They didn't know it yet, but from that night on, they would no longer be strangers. The morning light seeped through the cracks in the wooden walls as Eli sat across from the blind man, the fire crackling softly between them. After days of silence and vague answers, the stranger finally spoke at length, his voice low but steady. "I lost my sight trying to stop a war," he said, fingers tracing the grain of the table like it held the past. "Two tribes, bitter enemies for generations. I was a messenger piece was the goal." Eli listened, the weight of those words settling heavy in the room. He could almost feel the tension in the air. Thick as the smoke from the hearth. The man paused, drawing a ragged breath before continuing. "We met in the canyon neutral ground. They wanted blood. I wanted talk. They didn't trust me." He rubbed his temples, as if the memory was a physical ache. "Shots fired before words. An ambush, I felt. Eyes hit by shards of rock and flame. Sight lost, but not the voice." His hands clenched. "They wanted me gone. For peace to die. With me." Eli's heart thudded. The pain behind those words was raw, unfiltered. This wasn't just a story, it was a scar, fresh and deep. There was a long silence, thick with history and grief. Eli finally broke it, voice low. "Why come here? Why to me?" The man's lips twitched in something like a smile. "Because you don't ask questions. Because you understand loss." Eli nodded slowly, aware of his own ghosts, the family lost, the trust broken. "And because the war isn't over," the stranger said. "Not really. It's waiting to ignite again, with or without me." He looked toward the window, the sunlight catching dust motes in the air. "If I disappear, they will come looking, and they will come hard." Eli leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Who are they?" The blind man's gaze didn't waver. "Those who profit from war, those who fear peace. They want silence." His voice dropped to a whisper. I carry secrets, names, plans, truths that could change everything. Eli felt the weight of those words pressing down. This wasn't a simple guest needing shelter. This was a man hunted by ghosts and guns alike. A man whose presence could bring death or hope. The stranger's fingers traced a line in the dust on the table. My tribe believes peace is a seed. It needs tending. His voice cracked. But some would burn the whole field to ashes rather than let it grow. Eli could hear the tremor of fear beneath his calm exterior. I came here to rest, to find strength. He paused, swallowing hard, but also to warn. Eli swallowed. The stakes were higher than he'd imagined. His quiet life was now tangled in something fierce and ancient. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it a sense of urgency. Eli stared at the man, his mind racing. What kind of danger had this man stepped into? And how could Eli protect a stranger who might be a key to peace or a target of war? The ranch suddenly felt smaller, more vulnerable. But Eli's resolved, heartened. You're safe here, he said quietly, as long as I stand. The man nodded, gratitude flickering in his unseen eyes. That night, Eli lay awake, thinking of the stranger's story of peace, chased, lost, and fought for in silence. He understood now why the man had chosen his ranch, why he had asked for 3 days. Those days were more than rest. They were a countdown, awaiting for fate to decide. Eli didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing clearly. His life had changed forever, and the quiet plains around him were about to roar. The first light of dawn spilled over the ridge, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. Eli woke early, muscles tight from restless sleep, and glanced toward the stranger's corner. The blind man lay quietly, face serene despite the weight that seemed to cling to him. The air felt different this morning, charged, expectant. Eli brewed coffee, the rich scent mingling with the fresh morning air filtering through the open window. He knew today was not like the others. Something was coming. The blind man stirred and sat up slowly, the blanket falling away from his shoulders. His voice was calm but carried an edge of urgency. Water, he said, and Eli handed him a tin cup filled from the well. The man drank with deliberate care, as if each sip grounded him. Then, without looking, he said, no questions today. No company. Eli nodded, sensing this was more than a simple request. The man needed space to prepare for what lay ahead. If you have courage until sunset, he added, voice soft but firm, something sacred will happen. Eli watched him rise unsteadily and head to the door where he paused. Don't follow. The command wasn't harsh, but absolute. Eli hesitated. Years of solitude had taught him to trust his instincts, and this was one of those moments. He nodded again and stepped back inside, eyes lingering on the man's retreating figure. The plain stretched wide and silent beyond the ranch. Whatever was coming, it demanded respect and patience. The day passed slowly, each hour stretching longer than the last. Eli worked the land in quiet contemplation, his eyes frequently drifting to the horizon. The wind was gentle but carried a whisper of something ancient. The cattle grazed with uneasy calm, their ears twitching at sounds Eli couldn't hear. Time seemed suspended, like the world was holding its breath in anticipation. Eli felt a knot of tension twist deeper in his gut. He was waiting for a moment he couldn't yet see. Inside the house, the blind man moved with a purposeful calm. Eli found him at midday, sitting cross-legged by the window, hands folded in silent meditation. His face was peaceful but intense, as if listening to voices only he could hear. Eli respected the quiet, not daring to break the stillness. He sensed that the man was drawing on something far beyond the ranch, far beyond them both, a connection to the land, to the spirits of those who had walked these plains before. As the sun climbed higher, the shadows lengthened in slow, steady rhythm. Eli made sure the house was secure, doors latched, windows shuttered. He checked his rifle, fingers tightening around the worn stock. Though he didn't know what would happen at sunset, he felt the weight of responsibility settle squarely on his shoulders. This was no longer just about a wounded man. It was about honor, about legacy, about standing firm when the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath them. Afternoon faded to dusk, and the sky burned amber and crimson. Eli stood on the porch, eyes fixed on the fading light. The blind man appeared beside him, silent and steady, as if he had been there all along. Eli glanced at him, heart pounding. Are you ready? He asked softly. The man nodded once. Yes, it begins now. The world seemed to hold its breath again. The moment was here, poised between what had been and what was yet to come. As the sun slipped below the horizon, Eli felt a shiver run through the air. The first stars blinked awake, distant and cold. A quiet hush fell over the land. Eli looked at the blind man, whose face was illuminated by the last fading light. Hold fast, the man whispered. Tonight, the past and future will meet. And with those words, the night swallowed them both, plunging the ranch into darkness, charged with unseen power. The first knock came just as the last light slipped beneath the horizon. Soft but deliberate, Eli heard it over the creak of settling wood, his heart tightening in that familiar way when trouble rides in on a whisper. He stepped outside, eyes sharp, hands resting lightly on the rifle propped against the porch. 3 men stood at the gate, eyes, rough hands clutching rifles, faces carved from the kind of distrust that had no place for strangers. "We've been seeing someone near here," the tallest said, voice low and cold. A dark-skinned man wandering the plains. Eli's jaw clenched. He didn't want trouble, but he wasn't about to hand it over either. "Must have been shadows," he said evenly. "Maybe coyotes." The men exchanged glances, not convinced. "We heard voices, saw tracks." "Don't lie to us." Their guns shifted slightly in the moonlight. Eli kept his gaze steady. "You're welcome to search, but you'll find nothing." The challenge hung thick in the air. These weren't men used to being told no. One of the men spat into the dirt, eyes narrowed. "That's a lot of talk for a man who's hiding someone." Eli's hand moved subtly toward his rifle, but his voice stayed calm. "I'm no stranger to these lands. I don't hide things that don't belong." His stare hardened. "Now, you can either turn around and leave before someone gets hurt, or you can stay and find out what that means." The men hesitated, tension coiling like a snake ready to strike. After a long moment, the leader growled, "This isn't over." They turned their horses with slow menace, the sound of hooves striking dry earth echoing like a warning. Eli watched them go, muscles taut but face unreadable. He didn't need to be a prophet to know they would come back bigger, louder, with less patience. His chest tightened with a mix of fear and resolve. He'd chosen this fight the moment he took the blind man inside, and there was no turning back. Inside the house, the blind man sat silent by the fire, sensing the storm brewing outside. Eli closed the door carefully, locking it twice. He sat across from the stranger, voice low and steady. "3 armed men, they're looking for you." The man nodded slowly, expression unreadable. "They always come for what they fear, but we are not afraid." Eli's fingers tightened around his mug, the warmth a small comfort against the cold rising in his chest. Outside, the wind whispered warnings through the trees, bending branches like bent spines. Eli paced the floorboards, mind racing through every possibility, every plan. He couldn't let his guard down, not now. The blind man's presence was a beacon, drawing danger like moths to flame. But Eli had never been one to back away, not from storms, not from men, and certainly not from a death that felt older than himself. The night stretched long and restless. Every creak in the house set Eli's heart hammering in his chest. He kept the rifle close, eyes flicking to the windows every few minutes. He knew the men were out there somewhere, circling like wolves, waiting, watching, and when they returned, they wouldn't be so forgiving. Eli didn't say it aloud, but he was ready. The fight wasn't just for the stranger anymore, it was for the soul of the land itself. As dawn crept toward the horizon, Eli's resolve solidified like hardened steel. He would stand his ground, no matter the cost. The blind man was more than a guest. Now he was a part of something bigger, something sacred. And Eli knew that whatever came next, he wouldn't be facing it alone. The sky bled red as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting a fiery glow over the endless plains. Eli moved with practiced precision, locking every gate and bolting the barn doors. The wind was sharp and restless, tugging at the edges of his coat as if warning him to brace for what was coming. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing. Tonight wasn't just another evening. It was the eve of something ancient, something waiting to break loose beneath the crimson sky. Inside the house, the blind man sat motionless, his back straight, facing the open fields beyond the window. His hands rested calmly on his knees, but the air around him pulsed with quiet energy. Eli watched from the corner. The contrast between the man's stillness and the storm building outside impossible to ignore. The stranger's silence was no longer empty. It was charged, filled with meaning only the land could understand. Something unseen gathered in the dusk. Eli checked the rifle one last time, the cold metal cool against his palms. The taste of dust and sweat lingered in his mouth. He stepped outside, eyes scanning the red-streaked sky, heart thudding steady like a war drum. The cattle were huddled close, restless and uneasy, their low moans carried on the breeze. The prairie seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for a signal only the earth itself could send. Eli felt it in his bones. Something was coming, and there was no turning back. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a distant sound, a faint, rhythmic beat that grew louder with every breath. Eli strained to listen, muscles coiled, senses razor sharp. He wasn't sure if it was thunder or something else entirely. The blind man remained seated, unblinking, as if attuned to the song only he could hear. Eli felt a shiver race down his spine. The night was alive now, awake and dangerous. The land had secrets, and tonight it was ready to reveal them. Back inside, the stranger finally spoke, voice low and steady. "The Watchers are near," he said. "Not all are enemies. Some come to bear witness." Eli swallowed hard, a mix of relief and dread swirling inside him. "Who will come?" he asked quietly. The man's gaze didn't waver. "Those who respect courage, those who fear silence, but the day's end will decide." The words hung heavy in the room like a sentence spoken on the edge of a knife. Eli knew that sunset was more than just the end of a date, was a reckoning. The red sky deepened into a bruised purple as the sun sank lower, shadows stretching like fingers across the land. Eli stood guard near the door, muscles tense but steady. The air smelled of rain and fire, ancient scents carried on the wind. Every crackle of the fire and rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. He caught himself glancing at the blind man, whose expression was calm but unreadable. There was a weight in that calmness, something Eli wished he could share but couldn't. As darkness swallowed the last light, the land seemed to exhale, releasing a breath it had held for centuries. Eli felt the world tilt slightly, the balance shifting. The blind man rose slowly, voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight the past and future will meet. Hold fast." Eli nodded, feeling the magnitude of those words settle deep inside him. He gripped his rifle tighter, eyes scanning the horizon, ready for whatever was coming with the night. The stars emerged one by one, cold and distant, as the ranch stood poised on the edge of silence and storm. Eli and the blind man stood side by side, two figures against the vast, waiting darkness. The land was watching, and so were they. Whatever came next, the night would not be forgotten. Before dawn, the world seemed suspended in a deep hush. Eli lay awake, listening to the faintest sound stirring outside, a slow, rhythmic pulse like distant heartbeat. At first he thought it was the wind, but the pattern was deliberate. Drums, soft, distant, steady. His pulse quickened as the sound grew louder, weaving through the cool night air. Somewhere far across the plains, a signal was moving, silent, yet undeniable, calling attention to the ranch. Eli stood quietly on the porch, eyes straining against the dark as the first hints of morning painted the horizon pale gray. The drums persisted, steady and measured, weaving a haunting melody that seemed to carry stories older than the land itself. Then, through the mist, silhouettes began to emerge, shapes growing into men, hundreds of them, moving without a sound, like shadows sliding over the grass. Their numbers swelled with every breath of light. By the time the sun peaked above the ridge, the quiet army was fully revealed. Nearly 800 warriors stood, encircling the ranch in perfect formation. They didn't brandish weapons or shout demands. They stood tall and still, their faces calm and focused. The horses they rode were quiet and steady, as if sensing the sacred weight of the moment. There was no hostility, no anger, only a solemn, unwavering presence that pressed against the earth like a living wall. Eli felt the breath catch in his throat. His hand rested lightly on the shotgun, but he knew this was not a threat. These men had come not to fight, but to witness, to honor. Their silence spoke louder than any battle cry could. He glanced at the blind man who stood beside him, faced serene despite the crowd before them. "They come as guardians," the man whispered, voice soft but certain, "not enemies. Witnesses of courage." The warrior's leader stepped forward, a tall man clad in traditional regalia, his expression proud but peaceful. He raised a hand in greeting, the only sound the faint rustle of feathers and beads. Eli nodded back, feeling a deep connection ripple through the air. It was as if the land itself was exhaling after a long-held breath. The ranch, the plains, the people, all woven together in this moment of sacred recognition. No words were exchanged between the two groups, only gestures and eyes meeting with unspoken understanding. The horses shifted, and the warriors knelt. In quiet reverence, their presence both a shield and a blessing. Eli felt an ancient power pulse through the ground beneath his boots, a reminder that some bonds transcended language, that respect was a force older than war. The blind man's hand brushed Eli's arm lightly, grounding him. As the sun climbed higher, warming the earth, the circle remained unbroken. The ranch was no longer just Eli's. It had become a meeting place, a threshold between worlds seen and unseen. The quiet throng around them promised protection, and a promise that the past would not be forgotten. Eli inhaled deeply, feeling the weight and honor of the moment settle within him like a new dawn. The warriors stayed until midday, silent sentinels in the bright sun, then vanished as quietly as they'd come, leaving behind a stillness charged with meaning. Eli stood alone again on his porch, watching the plains stretch endlessly, forever changed by the arrival. The land remembered, and so did he. The moment was thick with silence as the warriors lowered their heads, kneeling in solemn respect before the blind man. The earth seemed to still beneath their bowed forms, the weight of history pressing down like a heavy, sacred cloak. Eli stood frozen, watching with wide eyes as the man he had sheltered rose slowly, his posture straightening with unexpected strength. Despite the blindness, he carried himself with a dignity that filled the space around him, an unspoken command that demanded reverence. Eli's breath caught as one of the elder warriors stepped forward. His face was deeply lined, carved by decades of sun and wisdom. He spoke softly but clearly, his voice carrying the weight of countless generations. "You have sheltered our light," he said, eyes never leaving the blind man. "Now it has returned to its people." The words echoed in the quiet, resonating like a promise fulfilled. Eli felt the enormity of the moment wash over him, a tide of awe and disbelief that settled deep in his bones. The blind man remained still, absorbing the elder's declaration. Then, with a steady breath, he bowed his head in gratitude. His voice, though calm, carried a power that stirred the air. "I carry the past and the future," he said, not as a burden but as a bridge. Eli could see the strength behind the words, a strength forged in hardship and hope. The warriors around him lifted their heads slightly, their eyes shining, with respect and something softer relief, perhaps. Or peace. Eli felt a wave of emotion swell inside him, pride, confusion, and a deep respect that he hadn't expected to feel for a man he barely knew days before. The silence between the groups was no longer empty but filled with a connection that transcended language and history. He realized then that he was witnessing something sacred, a moment where worlds collided and healed. The ranch wasn't just land anymore, it was a sanctuary, a place of reckoning and renewal. The elder turned to Eli, offering a nod of acknowledgement. "You have shown courage beyond words," he said, "not just in sheltering him, but in standing firm when others waver." Eli swallowed, the praise feeling both humbling and weighty. He had acted on instinct, on something deeper than reason. Now, he understood that his choice had set in motion a bond that would ripple far beyond the dusty plains and his quiet ranch. The blind man stepped down from the small rise, where the warriors knelt, and approached Eli. His hand reached out, steady and sure, despite his blindness. "You have chosen wisely," he said softly. "The light is safe with you." Eli grasped the hand, feeling the warmth and resolve that had carried the man through dangers Eli could barely imagine. In that grip, Eli sensed a shared destiny, a promise to protect and to remember. The warriors began to rise, their movements slow and reverent. The elder raised his voice in a low chant, a sound that carried through the air like the rustle of ancient leaves. Eli listened, feeling the vibrations ripple through the ground beneath his feet. This was no ordinary farewell, it was a ceremony, a blessing, a pact forged in silence and respect. The land around them seemed to breathe with the rhythm of their voices. As the last echoes faded, the warriors mounted their horses and prepared to leave. Eli watched them go, the dust rising in golden clouds beneath the setting sun. The blind man stood beside him, calm and steady. "They are gone, but not far," he said. "This is only the beginning." Eli nodded, knowing that his life, and the life of this land, had changed forever. The light had returned, and with it, hope. The campfire's glow flickered low as the warriors gathered their horses, preparing to depart under the deepening twilight. Eli stood silently by the gate, heart pounding with a mix of awe and uncertainty. The leader of the warriors, tall and regal, dismounted slowly, his eyes locking with Eli's in a moment heavy with meaning. Without a word, he reached into a small pouch at his side and pulled out a necklace, a string of polished black stones, smooth and cold as midnight. The leader stepped forward, holding the necklace out like a sacred offering. "This is for you," he said quietly, voice rough with respect and age. "You saved what the modern world tries to erase: the light, the memory, the soul." Eli's fingers trembled as he accepted the gift. The weight of the stones was heavier than their size, charged with history and unspoken vows. He looked up, meeting the warrior's steady gaze, feeling the enormity of what was being passed between them. Around them, the camp fell into a reverent hush. The other warriors watched, silent witnesses to this final exchange. It was more than a token. It was a seal of trust and gratitude. Eli turned the necklace over in his hands, the smooth stones catching the firelight. "I don't know if I deserve this," he murmured, voice barely above the wind. The leader shook his head. "You have chosen to protect the light when others chose to turn away. That alone earns this honor." Eli's thoughts raced back to the blind man whose courage had called these warriors here. He realized the necklace symbolized more than their gratitude. It was a reminder, a charge to stand guard over a legacy under threat. The land had its keepers, even in times when the world seemed to forget. "I will wear it always," Eli promised, feeling the solemnity settle in his bones. The leader nodded once, a small smile touching his lips, a rare crack in his otherwise stoic demeanor. As the warriors prepared to mount, the leader placed a hand lightly on Eli's shoulder. "We never forget those who honor the past," he said, "neither do the spirits." Eli glanced at the dark stones, imagining the stories they held, stories of survival, resistance, and hope. In that moment, the ranch was more than a place. It was a beacon, a flame lit in the darkness, carried forward by hands both new and ancient. The blind man stepped forward then, his voice steady but soft. "This is a new beginning," he said. "The path is not easy, but it is sacred." Eli looked at him, understanding now the full weight of those 3 days. The storm, the silent arrival of warriors. It was a crossing between fear and courage, silence and voice, loss and healing. He clenched the necklace tightly, feeling its pulse against his skin, a steady reminder of what must be protected. The horses stirred, restless, ready to leave. The quiet ranch behind the warriors mounted one by one, their silhouettes merging with the growing night. Eli watched until the dust settled and the plains were empty once again. The stars above burned bright and clear, as if the sky itself was watching over the promise made beneath its vastness. The necklace lay heavy against his chest, a bond to a world far greater than himself. As the last hoofbeats faded, Eli whispered into the cool night air, "We will not forget." And somewhere, beyond the horizon, the land seemed to answer, enduring, eternal. Eli woke to a silence so complete it felt almost unnatural. The first light of dawn filtered softly through the cracked wooden shutters, casting long beams across the worn floorboards. He sat up slowly, the events of the past days pressing against his mind like the weight of an unseen storm. Outside, the plains stretched out, calm and unchanged, as if the world had exhaled and returned to sleep. But something was different. The air carried a whisper of absence. The ranch stood intact, every fence post still upright, every window secure. No signs of damage from the storm or the silent arrival of warriors the night before. Yet, as Eli stepped outside, the ground told a different story. Footprints, hundreds of them, crisscrossed the dirt and grass, leading toward the distant tree line. Some were large, others small, all moving with purpose and urgency. They spoke of passage, of a gathering that had come and left without a sound. Eli's heart tightened as he scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the blind man, the stranger who had entered his life like a ghost and stayed like a shadow, teaching him lessons far beyond what the ranch had ever seen. But the man was gone. No trace remained except for what was left behind inside the house. Eli moved back through the doorway, the weight of the empty space settling over him like a shroud. On the worn wooden table, Eli's eyes caught sight of a single white feather. Delicate and pristine, it lay beside the necklace of polished black stones, its smooth surface catching the morning light. The feather seemed to pulse with quiet significance, a symbol of peace and connection between worlds. Eli reached out, fingers trembling slightly, and lifted it gently, feeling the softness that contradicted the heaviness in his chest. The necklace rested there, a reminder of the bond forged in the darkest hours. It was more than a trinket. It was a promise and a responsibility. Eli traced the smooth stones with a reverent touch, the memory of the warriors' bowed heads and the blind man's steadfast gaze flooding back. He understood now that the quiet that surrounded him was not emptiness but reverence, a moment for the land and its people to breathe, to heal, to prepare. Eli sat in the stillness, the feather in one hand and the necklace in the other. The wind whispered softly through the open window, carrying with it the sense of earth and rain. It was as if the plains themselves were watching, waiting for what would come next. Eli's thoughts drifted to the man who had called the ranch home for just 3 days. A man who had taught him the meaning of courage, trust, and silent strength. Though the blind man had vanished like a ghost at dawn, his presence lingered, woven into the fabric of the land and the hearts left behind. Eli knew that the days to come would be filled with challenges unseen but no longer feared. The ranch was no longer just a piece of land, it was a living story, a sacred place where light had been sheltered and now carried forward. With a slow breath, Eli stood and walked outside, the feather tucked carefully into his coat pocket, the necklace resting warm against his chest. The plains lay wide and quiet beneath the endless sky, but in that silence was a promise. The past had met the future, and both were watching over him. The storm had passed, but its echoes would never fade. Years had passed since the storm and the silent arrival of the warriors, but the story of the blind man never left Eli's lips, at least not in full. Instead, the tale had grown quietly, whispered among neighbors and travelers who passed through the ranch. One late afternoon, a group of children gathered by the old wooden fence, eyes wide with curiosity, eager to hear the legend they'd heard spoken of in hushed tones. Their voices filled the air with eager questions, eager to know who the man was and what had really happened. Eli sat on the porch, worn boots resting on the sun-warmed boards, a weathered smile touching his lips. He watched the children, their innocent faces lit by the fading sunlight, and felt a strange tenderness stirring within him. The man you speak of, he began slowly, voice low and steady, was no ordinary man. He could not see with his eyes, but he saw more than most ever could. The children leaned in, captivated by the gentle mystery woven through his words. They asked about the warriors, the silent army who had come in the night. Eli nodded thoughtfully, eyes tracing the horizon where sky met land. They came for a reason, because courage has a language that even silence can speak. He paused, letting the weight of that truth settle over the small crowd like a warm blanket. Some men walk their path with more than sight. They carry a light inside, a light that guides others, even in the darkest times. A small boy piped up, "Did he ever come back?" Eli chuckled softly, shaking his head. "No, but his presence never left. It lives here, in this land, in every whisper of the wind, in every step you take on this earth." He pointed to the necklace that hung around his neck, a simple string of black stones glinting faintly in the evening sun. "This is a reminder, a promise that light, once found, can never truly be lost." The children sat silently, the weight of Eli's words sinking deep into their young hearts. They looked out at the endless plains, feeling the vastness that stretched beyond their understanding. "Why did he stay so little time?" a girl asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli's gaze softened. because some journeys are meant to teach, not to stay. The most important lessons come in brief moments. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with strokes of amber and violet, Eli rose slowly. "Remember this," he said, voice carrying across the quiet land. "Some men see not with their eyes, but with their hearts, and those men are never truly alone. They are followed sometimes by armies, sometimes by hope, always by those who believe." The children smiled, their imaginations alight with the promise of heroes unseen but deeply felt. Eli looked toward the horizon, the colors fading into night. His heart swelled with the memory of the man who had come to his ranch, blind but seeing, silent but speaking truths that still echoed. He was a man remembered, Eli whispered, not for what he saw, but for what he showed us all how to see with courage. The wind stirred softly, as if in agreement, carrying the legend onward across the endless plains. The night settled around the ranch, peaceful and still. The story lived on, whispered from one generation to the next, a legacy of light in a world too often shadowed, and somewhere beyond the stars, the blind man's spirit watched over the land he had touched, forever a guardian, forever a guide.